Welcome back everyone to a new video on this channel. In today's tutorial I'll be showing you how to create this epic fantasy landscape in Blender. Yeah, it's all about quickly visualizing your ideas in Blender, especially landscapes. We'll take a look at the lighting and shading phase especially, which are very important, and the post-production will be done in Photoshop. It is packed full to the top with tips you might never have heard about, so stay tuned, have fun, and let's get started. Approaching such a complex project with your idea in your mind and the reference gathered, the first thing I would do is block out the scene with primitive topology, with cubes, spheres, planes, to really get a feeling for the scene you will create. To simply get the rough perspective, the camera placement, the placement of different objects, and I even go so far and add a bit of lighting in the scene to get the rough composition and where I want everything to be in the final image before I focus in too much on the details. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm adding in a camera, changing its aspect ratio, placing a floor and changing the camera placement in proportion to that. At this stage, it's a bit difficult to get a right sense of scale and proportion, which is why I'm adding this image of a hiker I found online and extracted from this image. Using the images as planes add-on, I add a new images as plane and choose my transparent PNG in this case. And let's have a look at this in the rendered view. I'm gonna place this transparent image of this hiker right in the center of the scene, and this will set my scale. With that, I now am able to see how large should all the other elements be in relation to my hiker. And that's very important because especially in the beginning stages, it's important to focus purely on proportion and not on any details whatsoever. And that's what I'm gonna do here. I have this idea of these pillars in my head, and I want to create these ancient old pillars, and I'm placing simply a few boxes which I scaled up on the Z-axis right in the scene. Yeah, now I'm placing them where it feels right. I'm carrying only on the placement of these boxes. I'm not worrying about any details whatsoever. I like to work a bit on the camera next. I change the aspect ratio and work a bit with the focal length, which is an important tool to change perspective. With these settings, I try to stay as close to reality as possible to get the best image out of camera. Now the idea is that there should be a large entrance right behind the last two pillars, right in the center, and there should be a large bright light shining in from behind. I'm doing that by adding a plane, scaling it up on the Z-axis and placing it right behind these last two pillars. And this will be my light emitter later on, as I'm now going to edit it in the shader editor. Let's have a look at it in rendered view and create a new material. I call it emission and simply remove the default principled shader and replace it with a simple emission shader. And increase its strength to really illuminate the scene, since this is our main light. I like to play around with the color management in Blender and add in a bit more contrast right from the start, since renders right out the box lack a bit of contrast most of the time. And I changed the world background to nearly black, but not totally, so you can see a bit of detail right in the front. So now that we've blocked out our scene, let's look at the details. There's a lot to talk about there. Let's first have a look at our floor, which is basically kind of like this rocky sea landscape. And this was created by simply enabling the ANT landscape add-on. And Shift A, let's add in a landscape. And now let's choose right out of the presets the large terrain preset, which creates this very large rocky surface. I would recommend to increase the resolution of this surface to get a higher quality. And as you see me doing here, I'm rotating, scaling, and transforming the floor. I even duplicate it and place it so that it looks good in the final image. With proportional editing, I submerge some of it under the water, and these little lakes are created by that. Let's join these geometries together, and now I'm going to show you a little trick to reduce topology. Let's select with box select everything that's visible in our camera view, press Ctrl I invert it, and delete everything that is selected in this case. This is an easy way to get rid of everything you do not see in your final image. And this reduces render times by a bit. Now let's select our lake and give it a new material. In this material, I'm gonna reduce its roughness, since it's a lake and should be a bit more reflective. And I also turn on transmission. With a bit of transmission roughness, get kind of this water-like material. Next up are these rocky mountain-like structures, which are placed between our pillars. As you might have guessed, these are ANT landscapes as well. So let's Shift A and add in a landscape. And there's already a built-in preset for a use case like this, which is the cliff preset. Simply add it in, play a bit with resolution. And now it's just the same as with our floor. Let's go right into the camera view. And now it's just placing them creatively to get a good looking composition. I place 2 of them right in front to frame the image. These will be hidden in darkness later on, and this will really lead the eye into the center. I added in a structure right between the light and the last 2 pillars to give it a sense of depth, and this really enhances this feeling. Now let's add in yet another landscape. You already know that process by now, which will be a rock. Yes, there is a rock preset in ANT landscapes. Didn't know that. Yeah, I would reduce the resolution to a lower number, like 100, for example, because it is not necessary that this rock has such many details, because it's just placed around the scene to break up some of these details. And yeah, that's exactly what I'm gonna do now. Let's scale it down. Always have a look at it from the camera's perspective, because this is what you will be seeing in the final image. And place it around your scene. You could, of course, use different rocks to get a bit more variation, but I think that's not really necessary. Just rotate it, scale it up, and nobody will ever notice. So now let's have a look at these larger stone pillars, because they're not simply cubes. They are indeed rocks-like structures, or at least something in this case. I'm not very good at sculpting, but I think it is enough for this effect. Let's have a look at how to create this kind of effect. Let's pick out one of these pillars right here and have a look at it in isolated view. First thing before you're sculpting anything is you need to add in the necessary topology, and that's what I'm gonna do with edge loops right from all 3 sides. And yeah, apply the changes and the scaling for very important, so you get the right proportions. Let's add in a multi-resolution modifier and subdivide your mesh a lot of times. And of course shade it smooth. And then let's start sculpting by firstly making these edges a bit sharper with the pinch tool. I try to do this with this line drawing option, which gives me this cool opportunity to draw them a bit irregular. And now let's add in a few layers and a bit of texture to our mesh. I have really no idea what I'm doing here. Yeah, of course, you could orient yourself at the real references of stone. You can use even stone brushes. But I'm adding creases, I'm sharpening the edges, I'm adding layers with the clay strips tool, and yeah, I'm playing a bit around just to get a basic texture. These objects are not highlighted in any way. You won't be able to see the details, and a lot of it is achieved by good shading. Yeah, and that's it. Yeah, and now I'm finalizing this piece. And yeah, as you see here, it kind of did the job quite nicely. Let's use this one pillar and distribute it and replace the others in the scene. Of course, you could put in the time to make individual ones for each pillar, but I get away with rotating and mirroring them and moving them on the Z-axis to get a bit of variation. This works in my case. So now let's have a look at lighting the scene. This is something very important. As you can see here, there are a lot of lights placed around the scene, one spot particularly around our main character. Let's switch to our sample scene right here and add in a new point light, which I'll be placing between the pillars. Have a look at it in rendered view and play a bit around with the strength and position. This is only there to add a bit of highlights on these pillars, because if I wouldn't have added this to the scene, they would completely vanish in the blackness of the void of this scene. Yeah, and now I'm gonna place a spotlight right around our main character to highlight it. Yeah, it's not physically possible that there is a light there. Maybe it is, but nobody cares. It is really to highlight a bit of the main character. Now I'm adding in a cube, which I scale to fit the entire scene. This will be a volume. And I will use this volume shader to really enhance the depth, the feeling of depth in this environment. This will be enhanced in post-production later on a bit more. So let's add in a principal volume material connected to the volume output. Play a bit around with the density. You have to find the right value here. You can always change that and play around with the anisotropy to really change the way the light scatters through the scene. A lot of times this makes the scene a lot darker, and I combat that not with increasing our lights, but with playing around with the color management right in the scene to increase the exposure here, for example. And you see this really adds this volumetric, hazy looking effect, which is kind of cool. Now let's talk about shading. There are not a lot of textures in the scene because it's not necessary. We do most of it by the geometry and the interaction with the lights. Let's have a look at the lake, because this is not only this reflective surface we created earlier on, but there are these water ripples. And this effect is created by adding in a water texture like this one, playing around with its size, detail, and distortion to get these kind of waves, and feeding it right into a bump node. Which is set to a very, very low value to really get just a hint of water ripples on the surface, and which is put into the normal input of our principal shader. And combined with this reflective surface, it gives really this impression of a larger water body. This is of course just fake, and there are no real water ripples there. You could go over and do this with displacement. Add in a hint of a blue toning, right, to get this kind of underwater look going. Now for our rocky surfaces, I used a texture. You could do this with procedural texturing, I think, but I used this one from textures.com, which is a simple grunge texture. I applied it to our mesh, connected it with a mapping node, and that is what it looks like. I used a generated output here. And this is fed into multiple sockets. For once, there is, again, a bump mapping node with a larger value this time to get cool light reflections. And then I used it to feed it into our main albedo color. And I mixed that with a Musgrave texture, which got a bit of coloring with a layer ramp node. And I overlaid that on top of our grunge texture to give this a bit of color. And this is fed right into the base color of our shader, which is this final rock effect. And this is used all over the place for these smaller rocks as well as for the larger mountain surfaces. So pretty easy shading right there. And it's a similar similar story for our pillars. I used UV mapping in this case, and used a similar but a different, slightly different texture, a grunge texture as well. Also from textures.com, which is put again into a bump mapping node, and into our base color as well. I've reduced the contrast a bit right there, and very additional thing is I added in a color ramp node and connected it to the roughness input to give it kind of this wet look, which is done by lifting the blacks a bit and giving this a bit more contrast to make it kind of looking like there's water dripping from these old ancient pillars. Yeah, for the render settings, I'm using Blender 3.0 Alpha, which contains Cycles X, which makes it very fast to render. And I decreased the noise threshold to really get a clean image. You can enable denoising as well, and I played a bit around with color management in the scene to give it a color profile which I can work with more easily right from the start, and to get a better sense of what the final image looks like. And now let's render it. For me, at least, post-processing is one of the most interesting and creative parts of this whole process because it really brings your image to life. Let's look at each layer from the bottom below. Here I've given it some glow, and this glow especially is created by a very simple technique. For that, let's add in a new layer and combine all layers to this one, convert it to a smart object, and press Ctrl L to adjust the levels and increase the blacks a bit to only limit our effects to our lightest parts. With a Gaussian blur, I'm now gonna blur out this image, change its blending mode to screen or lighten or soft light, whatever fits your scene, and change the settings afterwards. And with that, you can see you can really give this a cool glowing effect, which you wouldn't be able to achieve in Blender otherwise. I just remove it from the parts where I don't want it to appear, and yeah, that's how you can create such a cool glow effect. I added a few more glows right here by simply drawing them on the screen like this, with a white foreground color, of course. And I gave it a bit of variation, made some smaller ones, some larger, to give it some sense of volume and texture. And then again, reduce the opacity quite a bit. Now there I added in a few details because I was feeling like this image is a bit lacking a bit of detail right around this bottom floor. I grabbed this stock photo from elements.envato.com and placed it right in the scene. I did some changes to it. For example, I changed the mode from normal to overlay and added a few adjustments. For example, I increased the contrast quite a bit and removed all colors from the image to make it fit better into the scene. And with a layer mask, I masked out everything that I didn't want to appear. And yeah, this is what I added there. I tweaked some coloring and lighting issues right around there. And as you can see here, I added in a lot of haze, and if you focus on the bottom part of the image, I drew a black spot right where this water surface was. Now here I added in some cloud effects, some volumetric haze, which I did by using a cloud brush, and I'm now gonna show you how to get kind of this effect, which is pretty cool. It adds a lot of depth and volume. This is basically the story I'm telling all over again. It's all about creating depth. Yeah, and I simply drew again a circle with a brush and changed this to overlay, added in a layer mask and removed it where it is obstructed by the pillars in this case. This is very important that you do that to really get these layers of smoke or dust or haze, whatever this is. And you can do this with a simple brush like this one, simple circular brush, but I did some with a cloud brush I found online, and there are a lot of them for free. Just Google for it and you find some. Let's place such a brush right here, and you can do the same trick as we did earlier with that. Change its overlay mode, change the opacity, and draw with a layer mask wherever you want it to appear. You can even use it for some haze on the floor by simply transforming it so that it looks kind of more like it is in this perspective. And yeah, here I added in some more contrast, and right here a bit more of haze variation, especially a bit smaller details. In this case, I drew a darker spot around this pillar to because I felt it like it was a bit too prominent in this case. In this layer, I added in some color, which I simply drew on with a brush and changed its overlay and opacity. And added a bit of blue and kind of a yellow-orange color to get a bit of color contrast, which I'm now going to enhance with the color grading. I do this with color lookup tables. I place a lot of them right up top each other and change their blending modes, opacities, and their main settings. And this is a very cool and quick way to very quickly get cool looks in Blender, in Photoshop, which is very easy. Because I really like this look, I'm now gonna add in some micro contrast with a high pass filter. Let me show you how to do this. Create a new layer and combine everything onto this layer. Go to Filter, Other, and High Pass. Choose a rather low value like this one. Change the blend mode to soft light or to overlay, whatever fits your needs. Reduce the opacity, and this will give your image a bit of micro contrast, which is really cool. Now in this curves adjustments, I gave it a kind of a filmic looks with by lifting the blacks a bit, but keeping the midpoint where it is, and this creates this very cool filmic look, which I enjoy in these kind of renders. Next layer, I used Camera Raw filter to bring out really the details and the colors in this image. Let me show you what I did there. Let's again create a new layer, go to Camera Raw filter, and play a bit around with the settings. I felt like this scene is a bit warmer because there's this warm light coming right around from the outside. And I played around with the lightness, lighting, shadows, with the contrast. In fact, which works really cool here is to reduce the clarity to give it a kind of a softer look and to remove this digital edge, as it's often called, from these images. Play a bit around with the vibrance and saturation, and let's do a bit of noise reduction and sharpness, because I use the undenoised render, noisy render right out of Blender. And now let's add in a bit more blue to the shadows and a bit more orange to the highlights to really get this color contrast of these complementary colors going. Maybe add in a slight vignette, but not overdo it with that. That's a step I oftentimes do right before the end of my final composition to give it really the last little bit of kick. Now in the next step, I added in a bit of lightness right around this center part here to give it a bit more, a bit brighter appearance, since I thought it was a bit too dim. And in this case, I drew a shadow right around our main character, because I felt like this was missing a bit as well, since there is such a strong light coming right from the front. You can't really see the shadow, so I painted it in manually. Just create a new layer, choose a brush, and paint with black colors, something that kind of looks like a shadow. It doesn't need to be exact right here, since we're gonna make this a lot less visible. Change its overlay mode to multiply, reduce its strength, and with a black brush, paint a layer mask to remove the last part of it, so it's just right beneath him standing there. And yeah, I did some final adjustments to the light right in our exit, and added in a bit of haze, especially depth haze. So the deeper you go in an image, the hazier it normally gets. I did this by adding in a new adjustment layer and in this levels adjustment, I increased the blacks, and you can decrease the highlights as well to remove the contrast basically in this part of the image. And with a layer mask, I inverted it and painted it in wherever I wanted it to be. Beware that you need to reduce the opacity of our layer mask as you get closer to the camera, since it's a lot less stronger right there, and to hide any parts that should be occluded by the pillars. And that was a bit strong for my taste, so I changed it a bit later on and reduced its opacity. And this really got, again, a feeling of depth, which wasn't there before. And I finally added in back some detail of these rocks right in the background. Just overlaid the original rock texture right here with a layer mask with set to luminosity. And since it was missing some color, I drew in a bit of orange on top of that and changed its overlay mode to color. And this blended beautifully into a final image, since I thought this was very important because it's a very cool effect. Yeah, and that's everything I did to the image. Yeah, and let's have a look again at the before and after. It's amazing what you can do with just a few minutes of work. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and have learned something. If you want to download the project files, you can do so in the description below. Leave a like and maybe consider subscribing. This would really help me out. Thanks for watching and see you next time.